Okay, so welcome everyone to the final session of Seismic Academy. I'm the lead architect, Adela, and today I'll be talking about representation, poetry, and speaking architecture. Basically, I summed up a couple of topics that I wanted to hit that I learned about in my first year of architecture program. And yeah, hopefully you guys learned something. So, what is representation? It's how an architect's ideas and structural information is presented. Traditionally, this is in two dimensions. It can be something like diagrams, sketches, paintings, and now that we have the technology for it, things like photography, film, and 3D renders have also come to play a large part in representing architectural ideas and objects as well. When we think about technical architectural diagrams, for example, these are for the primary purpose of, providing information about the structure to the engineers who have to read it and understand it and use it to bring the project to life. The goal of these diagrams is basically to leave as little to interpretation as possible regarding the form and structure, but it doesn't need to try to resolve every single construction detail, because generally most important is its representation of the overall program and the thematic integrity of the structure. Of course, the level of detail and formality of a drawing or diagram depends on what stage of design the building is at, and depends on who needs to see it. But all of these details have to be looked at in the context of the building's program. And that's why it's always best to use as little to say as much as possible. So architectural drawings and diagrams should all be able to come together to give a holistic understanding of all parts of the structure that are essential to the design, but all without overwhelming with copious amounts of detail and information. So one of the most important tools for organizing a piece of representation is creating a hierarchy within the drawing. So to get technical for just a second, there are many tools and techniques that architects use to signal the importance of a specific element in a drawing, the most basic of which are lines and line weight. So the thickest line weight in a drawing should be the one that draws your eyes to it when first looking at the drawing. It's used to outline things that require emphasis, such as the overall perimeter, its walls. In a section representation, it's used to represent what the drawing is cutting through. So in this picture of a mug that I drew, you can see the cut line is going down the middle, and then we're looking at one face of the cut. And the boldest lines are where the mug is actually being cut through. And otherwise, these lines are used to represent things in the foreground, silhouettes, heavy materials like stone and concrete. The thinnest lines, on the other hand, should be used to describe background elements that are farther away, supporting information, fine textures, lighter materials, everything like that. And a line weight in between might represent things in the middle ground. For example, maybe important pieces of furniture or elements like stairs, fireplaces. Of course, we have different types of lines, so different pressures, dotted or dashed lines to represent hidden objects or objects behind the wall, hidden edges. And besides lines, what is also imperative to the readability of a drawing are things like entourage, so context, as well as scale, which can be used to suggest both hierarchy and program. Even in notation, so text, things like color, size, and font type all suggest hierarchy and clarity. So that's pretty much as technical as I'll get for now. A lot of this might seem like common sense, but it took a lot of practice getting into the habit of drawing representations that weren't disorganized, had strange colors, were from weird angles, or were just illegible. So to give you a personal example from my first year, this is a project called Toy Story, and the piece on the left was one of the pieces, the final comprehensive pieces that we had to hand in, that basically was a diagram for this toy on the right, a wooden puzzle. So we had to choose from a number of wooden puzzles and, represent it in 2D form. So to speak a bit about the workflow, we were asked to first study this puzzle in real life, figure out its solution, model it in Rhino, and then use that 3D model to get 2D representations. And afterward, all these line weights and colors and shading and arrangement and whatnot were all finalized in Illustrator. I also made use of my usual drawing program because I found it quicker for coloring, but that's basically the gist of it. And the reason I wanted to show this example is to basically talk about what I learned throughout the process about representation. The main theme of this drawing, hopefully it's easy to tell from this picture, is the red puzzle piece in the top right corner. So the puzzle is made up of 11 identical pieces and a 12th different piece, which is the key to the puzzle. Even before that, actually, the program or the goal of this drawing, it should be clear that it's kind of a descriptive, informational diagram of a puzzle. So like you can see kind of the procedure going around the middle, different section cuts to show what's going on inside it, and so on. And honestly, in the best case scenario, I shouldn't have to explain this drawing at all because it should speak for itself. As you can see, I don't have any text except for a couple of numbers, which honestly I also feel that I could have done without. I said that hierarchy can be seen in notation, but really sometimes the best captions are just none at all. Anyway, I'll go ahead and say that this definitely isn't like anything super original within the context of the project. There are only so many themes you can choose to represent with a simple puzzle like this, but going past the fact that we all found the same solution and we all understood that the key to the puzzle was this one different piece, we were given a lot of free rein in terms of arrangement on the final diagram. My first red line submission for this project, when I look back on it, I can see a lot of flaws. It was covered with red pen after my prof was done with it. But rather than drastically change any specific elements to get to the final copy, I chose to get rid of a lot of things that weren't necessary, declutter my drawing, and basically focus on the minimum that was needed to get my point across. After the red line, I also thinned everything down. Before, if you can tell, the thickest lines were kind of thick to the point of being distracting or offensive to the eye. And one of the biggest things I can still improve on the right side is you can see that I've used dashed lines in a strange way due to my urge to over-detail and over-clarify. And I was called out on it during the final review because, again, like I said before, I shouldn't have to clarify that, these elements are in a group and those elements are in a group. If I just place them a little closer to each other and perhaps a little farther away from everything else on the diagram, it would have been clear without any extra lines or information. So on the right side, you can see that I've used the dashed lines in kind of a traditional way to mark the hidden edges. But the fact that I also chose to, arrange it in a circle and there's the random line there coming off, rather than organize the drawing, it really confuses the readability. So yeah, that's just something I can still work on. Moving on, most people's understanding of architecture, I think, is that it focuses on the artistic design or, the outward appearance. But I think to me, it mostly just means that architects need to know a bit about everything. After all, a lot of things have to be balanced when designing a structure, not only its appearance, but the limits to what is physically possible and safe, how it'll stand on the site, how people will interact with it, how it will make people feel, things like that. It's not enough just to cover, practical flaws or mistakes with outward appearance. And I think even people who will never interact with the building at all except see it, and even those who might never see it at all, have to be considered because every building imagined and constructed, no matter how mundane or trivial, will definitely change the way people live in that space. Just like all other forms of art, I think architecture is always an opportunity to present values and opinions that reflect its maker or reflect the rest of society. Even architecture that was built and promptly destroyed will, live on in history, and we will find a way to learn about it. Buildings that we've never experienced ourselves still have the power to challenge our perspectives and views, whether that be in an economical way, environmental, political, agricultural, humanitarian, and so on. And all that to say that in order to portray a building that needs to say so much in just 2 dimensions, it's necessary to first totally understand its program. I think that architecture is often overlooked because of how subtly and normally it pervades our daily lives, but in reality, many such invisible buildings and structures that we pass through without thinking about it every single day dictate our everyday activities. For example, just imagine how maybe in a house, a large window and hallway might be aligned with the setting sun to allow an orange light to travel deep into the building in the evening. Or like in this example of Wright's Poynton House, the ceilings over these 2 dining areas might be lower in order to encourage an intimate feeling while eating with family. Things that might seem like common sense really did become common sense because they hide themselves so well into our daily routine. There are many things that architects need to relearn in order to subtly keep suggesting these elements that we're already so used to. This is why it's essential that the architect really leans into a design and portrays it in representation that way, in a way that we can understand it. So, for example, how space is divided to show a public versus private space, maybe the path of natural light, what path the architect wants a visitor to take in order to experience the building and in order to reach the main body of the building, and what feeling or atmosphere the architect wants to suggest. So this is how I think populating a drawing with context can really change how we perceive the structure in terms of its program and goal. For example, an elevation of the entrance columns to a temple might reveal that the building is aligned with the mountains and sun in the distance, which gives it some connotation of the divine or religious. It's evidence that the architect not only wants to show a view, but to frame a specific view. And this design theme that I've been talking about that determines the overall feeling of the structure is probably a familiar term, a partie. So take a look at these really fun examples of parties that I've taken from architect Matthew Frederick. He's titled each of them here, but I think that even without any words, just from a glance, you're able to very quickly recognize the main theme in each sketch. My favorite thing about these is not only that they're incredibly simple to draw, because you can tell each drawing is only made up of a couple of lines, but they're also very easy to read and understand. So these are just some quick personal examples. In an exercise in a studio lecture once, the prof asked us to very quickly sketch some parties based on prompts that they gave us. So on the left side is a meeting space seen in plan from above, and on the right side is private spaces seen from an elevation or side view. So I said that I've been reading a bunch of architecture textbooks over the summer, and to be honest, a good majority of them tend to portray architecture in a somewhat like poetic or psychological or philosophical light, which probably doesn't really help our image as more artistic and less, I guess, intellectual than our engineer counterparts. And at times it also gives me the feeling that I can pretty much guess why many historic architects, infamous architects like Gehry or have such a big ego. But it's important to look at these aspects, I think, because after all, buildings are made to serve, human needs and desires, and much of what drives us to design and to do things is difficult to explain in precise, clean, technical terms. Much of architectural history, both within the professional field and from onlookers or just regular civilians, revolves around the debate about what is beautiful, what style architects should build in, for example, classical, Gothic, modern, etc. And all of this, I think, becomes a discussion about what brings happiness to people in terms of representation in architecture. And you might remember learning about how during the Industrial Revolution, the kind of divide between engineers and architects was both at its greatest and smallest. And the reason I say that is because while society ushered in a world of suddenly abundant iron and steel and new material, the temperamental nature of architects tended toward practicality and technicality as well. Yet with all of these new materials, they, in some cases, I think, struggled very hard with maintaining the balance between this cold modernity and a humanitarian accommodation. So this is the Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxton. It's often renowned as one of the most important postmodern industrial buildings. It's very about physical material. It's 600 meters of, the repetition of the same prefabricated iron and glass structure. And some architects at the time were, maybe understandably disappointed by the industrial mass production aspect of it, although it did make a lot of efforts to, preserve the site it was built on, and did end up looking very impressive and imposing, and was influential to, future industrial buildings. Another example, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy later on also struggled with reconciling form with function. The villa turned out to be pretty uninhabitable despite being a residential building because of flaws in its construction. And I think this is an example of where appearance is forced to cover for, mistakes in construction and all that. And it's also an example of where an architect prioritized practicality and technicality over livability. That's basically the reason I bring up the Industrial Revolution is everything I said about, people becoming interested in different types of happiness in architecture and the art of different places, different types of beauty, was, I guess, a little bit stunted by this material revolution in that everyone went back to focusing on the functional and exact, which was, of course, exploded by the prospect of capitalism, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So that leads me into my last part, which is about speaking architecture. Originally, speaking architecture was a term used to describe the style of revolutionary Paris architects, which I'll get to a bit later. But for the purposes of this section, you can pretty much just equate speaking architecture to literally architecture that speaks to us. I thought it would be interesting to lead into this with modern architecture because this isn't the genre that people really think about when they think of pieces of art or architecture or literature that speak to people, resonate in people, are interested in a human response, or depend on human reaction or interaction or agency. And modern architecture has earned a reputation of being cold, perfect, material-focused, form-driven, and it often appears to have no agenda except technically perfect forms. However, it's important to note that, and I paraphrase from the Victorian-era art critic and philosopher John Ruskin, who said that we ask two things of all architecture. Number one, to shelter us, and number two, to speak to us. In reality, I think modern architecture does have a hidden agenda. It wishes to communicate to us the futuristic elements of design, a new clean lifestyle that it wants to bring to people living in the society at that time. And it doesn't necessarily have to be poetic about it. It might just want to tell you something like how the building itself works, how it makes use of modern tech and modern material. When looking at buildings like the Villa Savoy, just an example, we shouldn't only notice its sleek white form, but also recognize it as the same as any other piece of architecture in that it has something to say to us. Its whiteness evokes maybe purity and medical cleanliness. It being made with reinforced concrete suggests trust and stability in modern materials. Being free from ornamentation evokes a satisfaction in, a simple life or an ordered life. And even its site and the way it was photographed in this photo here suggests that people still love to be in close proximity to nature, even when that nature is man-made and even when bound in their own extremely unnatural man-made building. The original speaking architecture, or architecture of Provence, represented a very monumental, exaggerated version of what I described earlier. It wants you to see instantly a narrative in a structure, and not only that, the architects have to represent these structures' enormity and scale and grandiosity in a way that we could be impressed by it while it was still on paper, as these projects were rarely ever, carried out. And also, I kind of wanted an excuse to show you these drawings because they are some of my favorite drawings of architecture that we've learned about. But yeah, the library on the top left, which was supposed to be Boulet's extension of the Royal Library but was never realized again, is shown in perspective view straight down the huge amphitheater-like building to show off its walls on both sides lined with countless books, and is scattered with some tiny people to show off the massive scale of the structure. Even the skylight running vertically down the ceiling gives the whole drawing a kind of glow and makes it look truly royal and fit for a king, as the name suggests. On the top right is a prison drawn by Delafosse. Its rectangular form says stability and order and regulation. On the bottom is a long, gloomy, panoramic drawing of a cemetery by Fontaine. And I'm not going to describe these pieces to you too much, since I truly believe they can speak for themselves. Except for this one, because I had a paragraph analyzing it that I wanted to show off to you by a historian called Oslander. This is Lequeux's Temple of Equality, and this paragraph talking about it was about architecture during Revolutionary Paris. Just to quickly get the main points across, Auslander said that Lequeux chose to triply underscore the theme: a smaller sphere is inscribed within the larger sphere, and the unrelenting roundness, as even the round columns are missing their conventional square bases, is destabilizing. The outside of the globe is, however, both nationalized and made less abstract by a parade of tricolored flags set into the top. The flags humanize the temple, bringing it back to earth and grounding it in the French nation. Overall speaking, architecture, I think, tried to be more evocative than traditional classicism. Like all stylistic revolutions in architecture, this original speaking architecture worked because it opened people's eyes to a new kind of beauty that combined classicism and monumentalism and naturalism, and it brought about a new happiness that tapped into something different. For example, maybe the happiness of being smaller than whatever is out there, or the happiness of having a certain control over something so massive, or the happiness of permanency, to say that we left a physical mark on the world, or that we came up with something that might outlast us. I really love the term speaking architecture because of how well it summarizes the nature of design in general. As I said, technically all architecture is speaking architecture. It's just another facet of our living that we wish could talk back to us, because we're pretty lonely. But more than that, architecture is like art or literally anything else that demands our agency in its design. I think it's all kind of propaganda. It strives to evoke a response in us. It wants to tell us about all kinds of ideals. And the fact that we all have different ideals and the discrepancies and differences between these ideals versus, the actual nature of a building's clients, its inhabitants, activities that go on in it, and so on, are great grounds for discussion. After all, architectural design is never innocent or clean of the human agenda. It constantly speaks to us through quotation, symbolism, and whatnot. These pictures are from a book called The Architecture of Happiness by the philosopher Alain de Botton. And the reason I want to bring it up is that his writing on the architecture of happiness is pretty much what opened my eyes to the importance of architecture without being overly, egotistical or boastful. It was written in a way that prioritized the human experience, which does make it kind of selfish and human-centric, but it did teach me how much we're connected to the things we build, no matter how mundane, and how we need to have a responsibility over what we design, who we design for, how we represent our ideas on paper. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have for today. I know this is kind of a long presentation and I tried to talk about a lot of things, but hopefully I was able to bring something new to you guys and maybe have you understand a bit of what architecture is about.